Thank you, everyone. We'll get started very shortly. And so we'll now welcome in the two teams that have made it to the grand final, Auckland Blue and Otago. So let's congratulate them. So we will begin very shortly, but before we do so, we have a number of special guests that will be watching the debate, our patron, Stephen Koch, as well as our sponsors and a number of MPs from a wide variety of parties. So to welcome them in, please stand as the official party enters. Thanks, everyone. You can take a seat again. The motion today is a bit of a wordy one. This House believes that the biggest threat to freedom of speech in liberal democracies in 2024 is no longer the state. On the affirmative, on my right, we have Otago, and on the negative, we have Auckland Blue. Before we begin and hear from some of New Zealand's brightest school children, I'd like to invite up a very, very special guest who has given a huge amount of service to this organization. Chris Bishop first started with this organization in 2000, when same year I was born. Sorry if that makes you feel old, Chris. But he, despite being a senior minister, a recent father, he still finds the time to take a few hours out of his busy schedule to help us out with hosting this grand final in this amazing venue, and also giving back to the community in other ways. He has recently judged at nationals, he's coached teams, coached the world's team, and also been a very, very dedicated member of our executive. And so, of course, we have recognized him as a life member, and I'm very, very honored to be able to invite him up to open today's debate.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Can I first of all welcome you all to the Legislative Council Chamber of Parliament, and I'd like to congratulate our two finalist teams who've made it through the 2024 Nationals Grand Final. Can I also acknowledge the patron of the New Zealand Schools Debating Council, His Honour Justice Stephen Koch, who's of course a judge on the Supreme Court, and in a nice piece of symmetry, His Honour hosted all of the competitors and participants on Friday night at the Supreme Court just across the road from Parliament. And of course, those of you who are into constitutional law will know that of the three branches of government, we have been at the judiciary on the Friday night and now here on the Monday afternoon. Here we are in the legislature, right next door to the actual debating chamber itself, and of course the old Legislative Council chamber. And I understand that some of the finalist teams have been actually preparing in the beehive itself, the other branch of government, the executive government. So that is what debating does, of course. It is all about the law and government. So wonderful to have you here, Your Honour. Thank you for your support. Also, I want to acknowledge some of my parliamentary colleagues here. We've got the Honourable Karen Chua, who's the Minister for Children, the Honourable Deborah Russell, former Minister in the last government, and the Honourable Jan Tinetti, former Minister for Women and former Minister of Education as well. And some of you who know a little bit about debating will know that the Parliament itself is made up of many former debaters. It's not just me, there's also Deborah Russell, who was a former debater herself, Ginny Anderson, Megan Woods from the opposition, Nicola Willis, the Minister of Finance, once competed here at Parliament in the grand final of the New Zealand Schools Debating Championships in 1998 for Auckland. She didn't win, but I did. It's wonderful to have you all here at Parliament. For those of you who haven't been to Parliament before, which I suspect is many of you, where you're seated is the Legislative Council chamber. Up until 1952, New Zealand had the equivalent of the House of Lords, the so-called upper house, and this was where the House, or the Legislative Council chamber actually sat. These days it's used for functions like this, events, debates, seminars, forums, and of course when Parliament opens, as it most recently did after the last election in November, early December, this is where the state opening of Parliament takes place, and actually where I'm standing is exactly where the Governor-General, Her Excellency, stood after the election and read the speech from the throne, which is the government's agenda for the next 3 years. So debating is all about free speech. Debating is all about engaging in a contest of ideas, and that of course is what politics is all about as well. And so it's highly appropriate that the final is here at Parliament, as it has been for many, many years. I think since 1990 the grand final has been at Parliament. Also, I want to acknowledge the support of our sponsors and the Free Speech Union, who have helped make this afternoon's final take place on a topic that I have to say is incredibly relevant and appropriate in the modern world. And I, for one, am looking forward to that clash of ideas and that clash of debating. So may the best team win. Congratulations to both finalists. Thank you for coming to Parliament, and let's enjoy the debate. Kia ora.
So it's now time for the debate itself to begin. If you're not familiar with the rules, speeches are 8 minutes long, and teams can offer points of information between 1 and 7 minutes. So if you hear them saying something like that, like POI, that's what's going on. POI is just a short question. Please welcome up the first speaker from the Affirmative team.
Geez, there's at least a couple of people in here, so... Oh, gosh, I forgot my phone. My bad. Okay, I'll be starting my debate in 3, 2, 1. This debate is not a value judgment on free speech. The only question in contention here is whether the state is the biggest threat to freedom of speech or not. Okay, firstly, I'm going to go on to some context and framing, then on to our two main points on firstly the constraints to state power, and secondly on the real threat to free speech, which is independent censorship. Firstly, on to some context and framing. What is free speech? This is pretty intuitive, but quite simply it is the ability to say or express any opinion. What constitutes a threat to free speech? The only way to literally restrict someone's free speech is to come up behind them and clasp your hand over their mouth to stop them from speaking. So what this means is, in this debate, what constitutes a threat to freedom of speech is what scares people and stops them from speaking in the first place. 200 years ago, when the government could literally kill you if you said something they didn't like, that was a pretty big restriction to freedom of speech by the state. But why is that no longer the case? And this leads me on to my first point, which is, why is the ability for the state to limit freedom of speech relatively constrained in 2024? I've got 4 mechanisms here. Firstly, in order for the government to pass a law that genuinely affects free speech, it has to be supported by a majority of the electorate, because, you know, a democracy. Why do people not support these laws? Firstly, they are afraid the things that they will say will be punished. Secondly, citizens in a democracy are told that freedom of speech is integral to democracy, because in order to have a representative democratic government, you must first have the exchange of ideas. And thirdly, it's hard to make it into an election issue because it's not high stakes in comparison to other issues like economic or education policy. And what this means is that in most liberal democracies, that there isn't a general appetite or incentive to restrict free speech, which means that the state is unlikely to do so. This moves me on to my second mechanism. A large part of what threatens free speech is perceived risk. People won't say the things they want to say because they don't find the cost-benefit analysis to be worth it. But even in cases where the state does actually pass legislation on free speech, they are often quite removed from people or just the average voter. For example, you probably can't name a specific restriction that the New Zealand government places on your freedom of speech. And this leads me on to my third mechanism, which is like if anything, in the minority of cases where liberal democracies try to enforce restrictions on free speech, this causes so much controversy and media attention that one, they probably back down, and two, this media probably amplifies freedom of speech by spreading the thing they wanted to be shut down in the first place. And on to the fourth and final mechanism, I think we're all relatively aware of independent lobby groups for free speech, like the Free Speech Union. Can you name a singular group called the Anti-Free Speech Union? This means that there just are far more groups which hold the government and lobby them to prevent them from threatening free speech rules and laws. At the end of this point, I believe you should think two things. One, the incentive for a liberal democracy to restrict freedom of speech is low, but also two, in minority cases where states might actually threaten free speech, there are fail-safe mechanisms which minimize the impact of this threat. And before I move on to the second point of this debate, I will actually take a POI.
The state has a unique capacity to shut down opposing ideals through things like violence, such as the Israel-Gaza protests in the United States universities. Why is media or independent censorship so much more of a threat to freedom of speech when they can employ violence?
I think the main problem there is not freedom of speech. I think the main problem for those universities that they considered it a trespass of property and that was problematic for them. I don't think there's any problems with Free Palestine or Israel protests out in the street. The main problem there was that the university considered it trespassing on their property with their encampments and stuff. Okay, this leads me on to the second point. What is the biggest threat to free speech? Okay, what do we think it is? It's independent censorship. What do we mean by this? The interactions between individuals and or non-state organizations, like, for example, their jobs or the internet or their friends. I will talk about these examples as I go throughout this point. This looks like, for example, Melissa Barrett being fired from the film Scream 6 for saying Free Palestine, or Harvard graduates not being able to graduate for similar views. What does this mean? 4 mechanisms here. Firstly, when an individual person says something controversial or problematic, they're far more likely to get fired from their job rather than thrown in jail. Why is this true? Because this minimizes the impact on what they say on the company and their brand and how it's perceived. The reason why this is different to the state is because the state isn't considered responsible for the things people say, but is considered responsible for safeguarding free speech, as I mentioned in my framing. On the contrary, companies are considered responsible for their employees and what they say. This moves me on to the second mechanism, which is the capacity for you the capacity for you to be punished for what you say is far more proximate to you than hard to conceptualize risk of punishment by the state. This looks like how I have no friends at school because I'm just too much of a feminist, right? There's immediate risk to your social group. Neg might claim that this harm is so small that it doesn't impact what people say, but your social interactions are what dictate your experiences in everyday life. There are many cases where you don't say something in a social situation because you don't want to be like a friendless loser. And this leads, actually, before I go on to my third mechanism, I will take one more POI.
Okay, if people are afraid of violence and violence is actively being used to shut down individuals' capacity for free speech, why are people incentivized to even exercise it when there's the threat?
I believe you're still referring to the previous example you brought up about the university protest. I believe, again, that was because of, they were trespassing on university property, or the university thought they were, not because they were expressing the right to freedom of speech. Again, we see many Free Palestine protests outside, like in the Octagon back in Otago, right? We're not, that isn't actually a feasible, threat to them. Okay, moving on to the third mechanism, which is 2024 is the age of the internet, where a unique mechanism of restricting free speech has developed. And this is called doxing. Now, if you don't know what doxing is, I'll explain to you what it is, because, you have a few, not internet savvy people in the room right now. So, if you say something controversial on the internet, then there's a risk of information like your home address, your face, your family being leaked to the internet through just complicated hacking methods, right? So there's a risk of actual harm to you by this. But at the very least, if you don't believe that, you can get just severe bullying on the internet or harassment due to that, or expressing an opinion that people don't like. And on to my last mechanism, which is in Neg's best world, where you literally get thrown in jail for 5 years. Once you get out, they're not literally following you around all the time. Like, we don't all have a secret FBI agent, right? But who can do that? Your friends, like your internet footprint, and your employees, and what you say online. Oh, I mentioned that before, whatever. This means that independent restrictions on free speech are much more long-lasting and possible under what we are saying is the biggest threat. So at the end of this debate, you should believe in two things. One, independent censorship has a much greater threat to free speech, but secondly, that there are far less checks and balances to this kind of like threat to free speech. This means that it just has a much larger impact because it can't be contained, like with the checks and balances which any legislation the government passes can have. Thank you, proud to affirm.
I'd like to thank the speaker for a fantastic opening speech. In between each speaker, I'll introduce the members of the judging panel who will vote on who wins. The first member is the chair of the panel, Daniel Meyer-Gant, or as he's known as many in the community, DMG. DMG started on the Canterbury team in 2013 and 2014, and we're so pleased that, like so many of our alumni, he continues to give back to the community as a member of the adjudication corps at this Nationals. Daniel was also the chief adjudicator at the most recent World Universities Debating Championships, which was hosted in Vietnam, so we're very, very lucky to have such a talented member, such a talented adjudicator on the panel. That said, now is the time for the reply from the negating team, so please welcome First Negating.
I gotta set up this paper. This is kind of a mess. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, members of the panel, I think it's quite disingenuous for side Affirmative to come up here and tell us that there are many checks and balances as to which the government is able to infringe on people's free speech when we see people in the United States protesting for Palestine and then have the government send the military there to shoot at them with rubber bullets, to literally kill them when they're actively protesting for what they believe is right. Honestly, I think it's not true that these people are just trespassing, but even if you believe that is the case, the threat of that is incredibly damaging. I think the state has an incredible coercive power I'm very proud to oppose. 3 things I'm going to do in this speech. First, some setup, then as to why the state has a unique capacity to stop people from exercising their freedom of speech, and then why the state can influence people's voting. On setup then, what does an infringement of freedom of speech actually look like? 2 things. First is about the small daily infringements on free speech. This looks like generally not wanting to say things that are insensitive to other individuals. It looks like being scared to talk about certain topics. But I think what's more important is about large institutionalized crackdowns on free speech. This looks like not being able to protest in general. This looks like not being able to talk about certain topics in institutions such as education. This looks like not being able to vote on issues that mean your democratic voice is unheard. I think that's the context of this debate. Before I move on to my first point, though, I want to quickly take a look at their point on how government has checks on their power. Note that they told us that people need to be supported by like a majority of individuals in order to implement policies that actually harm free speech. However, I don't think this debate is about whether or not governments are able to implement a bill that say that people aren't allowed to speak freely. What this debate really is about subtle ways in which the government is able to influence people's free speech. This looks like bills such as banning hijabs in France that mean that people aren't able to actualize their freedom of being Muslim. I think it also looks like things like protests. I'll get onto that now. Why does the state have a unique capacity to stop people from exercising their free speech? The context of this point is that states often have their own incentives and beliefs. This looks like how America is very pro-Israel, even though there is a very large amount of young voters that are pro-Palestine. Note then that the state, because of its agreements internationally, does not want to be seen as pro-Palestine. I think this is the point at which states have their own incentives that do not necessarily align with the people of their country. Even if the state is voted in by the majority then, there are still individuals within that country who believe in the contrary. It's impossible for a bill that fully covers every single thing. So then, why does the state have a greater capacity to crack down on individuals? 3 reasons. First is that the state controls the military and the police. Note then that they're able to commit physical violence to these individuals. This looks like the protests in the United States. Note then that if these protests were just about trespassing, these people probably wouldn't have been shot at. I don't think the government is incentivized to shoot at their people just for being in the wrong place. Also, note that that's just factually incorrect. The point at which these individuals are part of the university, I think that's the point at which we need to understand that this is about free speech. This is because the United States does not want to come off as pro-Palestine. The ability to actually shoot and kill these individuals, that's what harms free speech. Secondly, though, is that the state responds only to the largest protests. Note then that states are able to directly respond to the biggest displays of free speech. This looks like how the Black Lives Matter protests were also met with violence. Note then that these are the fundamentally biggest places in which people are actually able to actualize their free speech. When they're able to go out in the streets and tell the government that they don't stand for what they're doing, that's what free speech actually looks like. When the government goes there and shoots at them, that's the point at which they're able to crack down on free speech. That's the point at which these individuals are unable to speak properly. Third, though, is that laws are passed independently from the people in most cases. This looks like how states have control as to which bills go into referendum. That means that most people aren't even able to vote on certain bills. This looks like how the Don't Say Gay bill is voted in Florida, when there are probably a large amount of people in Florida who firstly are gay, and secondly support the teaching of it, just as these people actually exist in schools. I think the point at which we're proving that these people don't even exist, that's the point at which they have disproportionate power over free speech. It looks like how France bans hijabs. It's very clear that there probably are Muslims in France. I don't think the point at which these people are silenced and aren't able to vote on these bills, that's why the government has that capacity. 2 impacts of this then. First is that large political movements are silenced. Note then that there are significant powers of political lobbying that come through things like protests. Note then that when the government is able to silence these individuals, it's very clear that these people don't actually have their voice. When people aren't able to vote on things properly, they don't actually have their voice. Note then that protests are like the biggest representation of free speech in a democracy. That when they're able to take that away and when they're able to shut them down, they use fear as a tool to crack down on free speech. Secondly, then, it sets precedence of being scared to talk about what you believe. Note then that people are scared to have these opinions when they think that when they go to protest, they are going to be tracked down significantly in violent ways. I think the high media coverage means that these people do have fear of this. No one wants to exercise their free speech to the point at which they are scared for their lives, even if it isn't directly in response to free speech. This fear stops people from being able to talk. That is a power the state has. 2 ways onto which to weigh this point then. First is on scale. That is, this is quite literally the largest exercisation of free speech. The point at which we shut them down and the government is able to uniquely shut them down, that's the point at which free speech is harmed. But second is just the depth of which free speech is harmed. Again, these individuals are actually using their voice. When we shut that down, I think that's very damaging. Before I move on, I'll take a point of information.
Yeah, the university students in America are exercising their right to free speech because they don't have things to lose like a job. Isn't it quite telling for your case that older people aren't out there protesting? They have more to lose.
Okay, these people may not have to fear that they will lose their job. What they do have to fear is the loss of their lives. I think that's even worse. Why then is the state able to influence people's voting? The context is that voting is how freedom of speech gets actualized in a liberal democracy. Note then that it is the direct expression of your democratic voice. Freedom of speech is valuable insofar as you actually have it heard on a political level. That's the point at which it actually has impact. So how does the government influence this? First, is the state is able to disproportionately influence people's thoughts. This looks like how they have a lot of money to be able to run ad campaigns. This is how they have a lot of rhetoric that actually justifies to individuals why they should think in certain ways. This looks like how a lot of older individuals in America are very pro-Israel because they live in a time where the state was pro-Israel. It means that they have it shows that the state has disproportionate influence over how people think. But secondly, the state often has information that can change the ways people vote. Note then, for example, the states in America use Cambridge Analytica and data collected from big data to be able to spread misinformation to influence how people actually think. Note then, processes of gerrymandering influence the ways in which people's votes are actually accounted for. This means that states hold disproportionate power over how people's votes actually get actualized. I think the government's lack of accountability, insofar as they do hold power over individuals, I think that's why they have disproportionate influence. Two impacts then. First is that people can't actually actualize their freedom of speech, the point where their thoughts themselves are corrupted and they aren't able to think freely. Second, they aren't actually able to vote properly. It means they're not able to actualize their thoughts. The second impact then is that they do have disproportionate access to be able to speak freely. This looks like how wealthier people are able to lobby the government to have policies that benefit uniquely them. This means that only some people are able to speak freely. It has unique harms to the people who aren't in far bigger ways. 2 points to weigh this then. First, our points are logically prior to their idea of independent censorship. That is to say that if people do infringe on other people's free speech, it comes from the state uniquely. I think this point on logical priorness is far more important. For all those reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank you for that lovely speech. The next member of the judge panel to introduce is Jaden Tucker from the University of Otago. Jaden was on the adjudication call last year at Nationals, which means he set the motions and helped organize the judges. And he's also a joint scroll winner, having won it in 2022, although some people claim he was carried by his girlfriend who was on the team. He told me to say that. I'm not, it's not my joke. And up next, to continue the case for the affirmative, please welcome second affirming.
Voting and speaking are not the same. Just because the government doesn't do what you want doesn't mean you don't have the right to say that you don't like what they're doing and to criticize their actions. 3 things to do in my speech. Firstly, on what does state power look like, and specifically on state incentives and violence. Secondly, on independent censorship and how that actualizes, and then on weighing in terms of does censoring big things constitute the biggest threat to free speech, or is it censorship in our everyday lives? Okay, firstly, on state power, we hear a couple of things, the first of which I flagged in my introduction, and that is not free speech to not have the policies that you want passed. I think this is pretty counterintuitive, right? I think that everybody in this room has a slightly different opinion. They have the right to express that through free speech that is not related to the right for the government to enact exactly what they want them to say. I think what that means is that the fact that there just isn't a referendum on every single thing that you want there to be a referendum on has nothing to do with your actual right to free speech. But secondly, I think that the perceived risk of state power material that we give you isn't responded to well here. They probably over-rely on the example of Israel-Palestine and particular violent protests, but I think that people don't genuinely think that in their everyday conversations, the state is listening in on them and going to come and clap a hand over their mouth and stop them from speaking, right? That's pretty important, because at the point in time where 2% of the population is participating in a protest and 98% of them aren't, I think the free speech of the other 98% probably just is bigger on aggregate, right? I think that's pretty intuitive, and they need a better response there. I think secondly then, on state incentives, they tell you that the state is just going to be violent because it wants to stop free speech. I think this doesn't really engage with what we tell you at first, right? Because if your state is genuinely violent, if you're genuinely killing protesters and you're a liberal democracy, note that nobody has died in the protests in the US. I have no idea where that came from.
Point of information.
People will just vote you out, right? Even if you agree with the thing that the state is trying to suppress, even if you think the state should be suppressing it, people are very averse to the idea that the government is going to kill you for saying something, right? That's the point in time where people do vote out the government. That's the point in time where the opposition picks up on this and is like, hang on, probably the government shouldn't be killing people. Maybe I run on this for the next election and get voted in by a supermassive margin, right? I think that's pretty intuitive. Second thing to note there is on the media. They tell you that you're going to totally suppress movements like Black Lives Matter, but note how bad this example was for their case. No matter how big of a response the state had to Black Lives Matter, I think we all still know what those protesters were saying. Case in point is an example in this debate, right? The media response to state violence inflates the reach of free speech. That's really important because the same mechanism doesn't exist for censorship in your day-to-day conversations. That's a totally outsized impact that only exists underneath. Lastly, I want to talk about lobby groups. Note that we heard no response here, but free speech is an issue that is really easy to rally around, right? Everybody who supports free speech supports the same thing. They want you to be able to say whatever you want. The comparative groups that might lobby against free speech, they have very different incentives, right? Some of them might not want hate speech laws, but some of them might be on the total other end of the political spectrum. That means that they can't join together and push policy on the government. That's really important at the point in time where lobbyists do have a massive impact, right? Where they have day-to-day interactions with your politicians that genuinely impact the bills that your politicians pass. I think at the end of that, what you should believe is the incentive for the state to actually do this violence is very low. The incentive for the state to restrict free speech is very low. But also, if they do, A, they get voted out, but B, some lobbyist group is probably just like, stop doing that, and then they don't get to do it. Look, I think a good example here is like the hate speech legislation, right? If New Zealand can't even pass this hate speech legislation, I think that tells you that the power to restrict free speech is probably pretty limited, given what that event came out of. I'll take a POI before I move on.
So if you don't like what the government is doing, why is the biggest way you can tell them no not your vote?
I mean, look, I think the freedom to vote and the freedom to literally say something are just intuitively probably not the same thing. But you still have the right to vote, right? And just because you don't have the right to vote on a specific referenda, a specific bill, doesn't mean that you don't have the right to vote for a policy, right? I think democracy doesn't work by we get to vote on every single action the government ever does, because that would just be entirely impractical. Let's talk then on violence. I think, firstly, what I tell you in my POI is that the people who are protesting in the US right now is just excellent for our case, right? These are university students who operate in liberal circles where other people aren't going to tell them that their opinion is wrong. These are university students who don't have jobs they can be fired from. They don't have people who depend on them who they need to feed. These are the people who are able to take on the risk of protesting. People who are older, it's not just that they're more conservative, it's that they have a lot to risk from independent censorship. When they lose their job because their employer found what they had to say objectionable, that is the biggest risk to free speech. Also, secondly, just on balance, there are a lot more old people than young people, so if you're a bigger threat to old people's free speech, that's probably a bigger threat to free speech, right? Okay. Secondly then, on who is more likely to use violence. They give you a lot of examples of the state using violence in Israel-Palestine, but I can give you a better example, and that is the independent censors who came and assaulted protesters on UCL campus in the middle of the night. And note that nobody can stop these people, right? Because if they want to hurt you, they will. If the government wants to hurt you, someone's going to do something about it. Maybe it's even just like the other branches of the state, right? The legislature or the executive or whatever, I don't know. Okay, so I think at the end, the other thing to note here is that Biden's stance on the Gaza and campus protests is just like genuinely very contentious and probably will flip the US election. So at the point in time when you buy all of this material from them, it's also bad because the state that is restricting your free speech is just literally imminently about to get voted out. That probably isn't very good, right? Okay, secondly then, on your day-to-day interactions. They agree, and you'll see up, that daily infringement is a big part of this. And I want to note here, just on scale, the average person doesn't have many times where they want to go out and protest something. They have a lot of times where they want to say something in their everyday life. So a couple of things to note here. I think firstly, we tell you that when the individual person says something that's controversial or problematic, they're far more likely to face consequences on the individual level, right? The reason why this is so important is because it's the most proximate to you. The government government is something that's very far away. Most people don't even know how it operates. However, your best mate telling you, I hate what you just said, or your job literally firing you is probably a pretty big risk. I think that makes people very hesitant to speak. But I think the second thing to note here is that we tell you about the unique power of the internet, right? The internet is full of independent actors. If you have to have 50% of people supporting the state for them to feasibly be able to restrict your free speech, you only need one person on the internet to decide they don't like what you have to say and your life is ruined, you get swatted, maybe you literally do die. I think that's a lot worse than anything Nick ever proves to you in this debate. I think the last thing to note under this point is what we tell you about the length of impact. Literally, even if you buy everything you say, you think people are terribly getting assaulted by the government and there's nothing to stop it. That happens once, right? What happens in our world is in a day-to-day, you don't say things, not only because you can't say them now, but because you're afraid of what may happen to you in the future, 10 years, 20 years down the line, where someone finds something you said all those times ago and calls you out on it. That's a much longer lasting harm to free speech than a government or a state that comes and goes. At the end of this debate, it isn't sufficient just to talk about protests. You have to prove that people's everyday lives are what is the most impacted.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that speech. The next member of the adjudication panel to introduce is Amber Sandhu. Amber and I both met in 2016 when we both missed out on the break. Amber missed out on Speaks, I missed out with significantly fewer wins. But since then, her debating CV has gone from strength to strength. She's a 4-time national champion, was named the best reply speaker in Australasia, and has twice been the best adjudicator at New Zealand university major debating tournaments. Please welcome second negating.
When you look at headlines of people being shut down, it always involves the state. It looks like France's banning of the hijab. It looks like Geert Wilders trying to abolish the mosque. It looks like the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. And these are the most tangible violations of free speech. Because you can't be a Muslim when the Quran is banned. The state's coercive power gave them the greatest capacity to oppose free speech, which is why we oppose the state. So, a couple things in the speech. Firstly, this responds to their material on how free speech is written. Then I'm going to talk about the state. And thirdly, I'm not going to do a split point because it's my free speech and not do a split point. Okay, so firstly then, on their stuff, the main thing they said is that you get socially isolated from your friends. What actually is a threat to free speech though? Because it's not about small instances of being scared of being insensitive, because maybe I can't make silly noises in Parliament, right? But I can go to Bruce and Kathy after the debate and make silly noises with them. If your friend group doesn't let you say specific kind of things, you can just move to different friend groups. The comparative is that when you want to talk, what we're talking about is people's fundamental identity being challenged. When the state completely restricts them from expressing the most important things to them, because you can't be a Muslim when you can't read the Quran. You can't express yourself as an LGBTQ plus individual in schools when there's a bill banning that. Next then on doxing, there are a couple things I want to note under here. Firstly, once again, there are instances in which you can avoid being doxed. You can just go to a different side of Twitter and not engage with communities that are going to dox you. But you can't escape the state. They said the state just punishes you and then ignores you. No, the state cracks down on you whenever you break that law again, whenever you go against the rules again. The second main thing to say under here is that our analysis is logically prior to them, because the only thing that actually really matters to this doxing is that somebody's going to come after you, right? But this is an issue of the state, because the state is the thing that impedes on your right to self-defense through things like gun laws. It's the thing that puts on lighter sentences on hate crimes, which is what allow people to go ahead and attack you. So therefore then, it's the problem of the state, not those individuals. And this also responds to when Clara talked about, random individuals going up and attacking minority groups. So the state, and also note under here, the state has a far larger capacity to harm people than individuals, as Bruce lined out to you. It looked like through legislation, it looked like through police forces, which had far more power than any individual person. They then said, well, you've got digital footprint. Guys, this debate isn't about the future in which people discover something 20 years later. This debate is about 2024 as in the info slide. So you shouldn't care about those long-term harms that they talk to you about.
POI.
The next thing they said is that, well, you could get fired. I think what companies do is prioritize being as inclusive as possible, because you just want as many people to buy your stuff as possible. So if there's a bigot that threatens people, makes them feel unsafe, if that person doesn't want to buy your product, so you go ahead and fire them. So maybe that company does, hurt that person's free speech, but it prioritizes all those other minorities' free speech that could be threatened by that person. They could feel unsafe due to the things that they say and due to the agenda that they push. So overall, I think very little of what they presented to you was standing in terms of the other methods in which free speech is standing. Let's then move on to what Bruce told you about how the state violates on people's free speech. But before that, I'll take that.
What has more checks and balances, the actions of the individual or the actions of the state?
Well, that's what I'm going to talk about now. So, the first thing I want to talk about is politicians and the state. There are two things to note under here. Firstly, they are the state. These are the people that make up, the legislative chambers. And even if they're not in power, they're still in Congress or in Parliament as just a minor party. Secondly, is that it's only with the existence of the state that these people are a threat to free speech. Because it's clear by politicians and right-wing populists express preference to try to use the state as a vehicle to persecute minorities and make them afraid to speak up. Now then, what the incentives on politicians to go ahead and try to violate people's free speech? I think the main thing here is that it's easy to create outgroups and easy to create scapegoats, and this is an incredibly powerful political tactic because you rally everyone around a common enemy. And the important thing to note here is that it's easy and intuitive to understand, because what they said is that you instead try to push things like the economy or the education. But obviously these things are far harder to understand with far more nuances and complexities. Meanwhile, it's far more politically palatable to present anti-LGBTQ plus narratives, to present narratives about Islam and how those people that's far more easy to understand to a large group of people. Why do they have an incredibly large capacity to try to manipulate the populace? Three main reasons. Firstly, is through political rallies in which they get their voter base and they spread bigoted agendas. And know that these people have a sense of legitimacy because they are in power. They are often seen as educated. They are often seen as the people that move the levers of the state. So when Republicans go up and spread anti-trans narratives, it has a large sense of legitimacy. Secondly, is that they create barriers to elections. They hold it on one day, which disadvantages oftentimes poor minority groups, which have to constantly work and don't have the time to go out and vote on one day because they might be too busy during that day. They ban mail-in voting, which is especially common amongst minority groups. The third main thing is that they do things like targeted messaging. Bruce told you about Cambridge Analytica. When they get people's algorithm feeds and they spread these messages, they target these other groups. They spread these hateful messages. And note that there's an increasing capacity to do so with AI technology, which gives you even more capacity to analyze these algorithms. And note that in 2024, AI is expanding exponentially, as I'm pretty sure we all know, which means that it is becoming a greater threat. The main impact of this is that it does lead to votes in which free speech is shut out, in which people fundamentally can't express their identities. Even if people can express it a bit better on the day-to-day, I don't care about that. I think the biggest threat to free speech is when you can literally never express it under any context, and that's the instance in which they can't do it. What were their responses? They said people like free speech. I have two things to note. Firstly, people dislike other things more due to the political messaging. So you dislike Islam more. You dislike the LGBTQ plus community more than you like free speech. But secondly, they oftentimes frame it as a threat to free speech. They tell you that the LGBTQ plus community is manipulating your kids. They tell you that Islam is trying to destroy Christianity and destroy your culture, which means so if people prioritize free speech, that means that they still try to prioritize on our side. And here they want to talk about democratic checks and balances, but no, there are many instances in which this doesn't work, like gerrymandering, in which they split up constituencies of minority groups to make their voting power weaker, like judgemandering, where judicial branches have too much power and they're able to overpass democratically elected in policy. The final thing I want to note under here is the context of Israel and Palestine, because I think that this is incredibly important context of free speech in 2024 for two core reasons. Firstly, it is one of the most sacred issues to individuals. Massive amounts of people all over the world have shown and expressed that they care about this to an incredibly large degree. But secondly, it's an instance where there is large tangible change. And this is where free speech is actually the most important. Whether or not state or university funding goes to Israel does have massive influence and is an especially important instance of free speech. And here what we told you about was the National Guard coming in and shutting down these protesters. They tried to say that it's just trespassing. You don't send the National Guard for trespassers. This is just like Vietnam, in which the state tried to shut down protesters against that. When Germany shuts down Palestinian protesters, and they tried to say that at the very least the message still gets in there. Two responses. Firstly, the plate and state are collapsing the hand over their mouth by tackling you down and arresting you. But secondly, obviously you could hear much more of it if they weren't shutting down your protests, which means that we have more free speech on the outside. Overall, I am incredibly proud to stand against the state.
Thanks, Jamie. Before we introduce our next member of the panel, a quick admin aside, which is that if you're seated in the gallery and you leave, you won't be able to get back in. So don't leave if you want to come back. And if you do need to leave for some reason, you could perhaps just sneak in through the back and take a seat somewhere at the back of the room instead. Cool. Our next member of the panel is Lucy Jessup, our current vice president. Jessie has broken at the last 4 major debating tournaments she's attended and also won the Officers' Cup in 2023. And a fun fact about Lucy is that she won a radio spelling bee against Dua Lipa. So ask her for more details about that if you want to know more. Please welcome Third Affirmative.
So I'm used to having more horizontal space in this, so let me just check everything's in the right order. And that way we'll have less awkward situations happening mid-speech. Great. Like what you've done with the place, by the way. Very nice walls, coloring things. Love it. Look, I think in a world where the negative side largely doesn't interact with a lot of the analysis they give you, you cannot buy their material. When they shut off things about, incentives around, your online footprint and things as being future problems and not influencing people, they don't engage with the very, very good stuff we give you at SAM and at Clara. Okay, 2 main things to do in my speech, largely umbrellaing this debate under the state and then independent actors and censorship and things like that. But a note on framing before I start. Note we tell you at the very start of our speech that obviously there's a very, very obvious and crucial point that, that if we're just talking about immediately preventing people physically from talking, this debate is largely a wash because it's just about which actor has, the biggest hands or the best ability to sneak into people's houses without them knowing. Therefore, we give you a lot of reasons as to what restriction of freedom of speech actually looks like. One of these things is fear and the things that prevent people from speaking out about what they believe in the first place. Note this as I continue throughout the debate. Starting off with the state, what do we tell you about the state? Right, we tell you that the state has lots of democratic checks. I'm sure the MPs in the audience can, affirm this, as they're pretty sure that they are not in an authoritarian regime, right? There are debates here around the extent to which these democratic checks exist, which I'll respond to later on. The state, we also tell you that when it does affect, it has limited reach in a lot of situations, right? Negative tries to respond to this. They tell you that bills and etc. are not referendums, and therefore that restricts people's freedom of speech. They tell you that about government's unique voting manipulation process that they apparently can do very, very easily. They tell you things about a lot of hijab bills, etc. They tell you that it's easy to create outgroups, and therefore the parliament has like an incentive to pass these anti-hate speech laws, etc. Right? So, 5 main responses here, right? Firstly, I think when they tell you about headlines and things disproportionately showing more government action, I think it actually benefits our side more. Why? Because I feel like it's showing that this government action against free speech is actually more easy to expose, right? It's more easy to out. Because when you see these things in the headlines, the news aren't supporting it, right? They're acting against it. This galvanizes these people. It actually makes them more easy to express their views. Why? Because they get more support, right? This looks like, for example, if I were to bring an example from my my home country, right? The leaders of the Easter Rising getting killed by the government, right? Which did restrict their ability to, breathe because they're now dead. But in terms of their freedom of speech, it gets amplified significantly because then it galvanizes support, right? Secondly, all of these points about hijabs are simply technically not viable here because that is freedom of religion rather than freedom of speech, right? These bills are under a different sectionality. They simply do not count. Thirdly, what do people resonate more with as voters? This is an analysis we give you at first, but it's not really properly engaged with, so I'd like to whip it up again. Do you think they engage more with A, speech, politics, and those sorts of in-depth geopolitical topics, or B, like if you're a single mother, being able to feed your family or drive to work, etc.? I feel like it's fairly obvious that it is the latter, right? What does this mean? This means that neg overrepresents to you the proportion to which people care about these freedom of speech things in laws. That, therefore, means that the government has less of an ability to restrict them through legislation, right? Fourthly, I think your ability to think and your opinions are largely exterior to the government, right? I think this is just inherently shown by dissent and protest, right? If the government was this easily and a prior logical, precursor to people like thinking and therefore not being able to speak their minds, you wouldn't see things like these protests and dissents, right? And I feel like fifthly, in terms of this gerrymandering point, right? This is the vast minority of liberal democracies, right? Maybe you see like the odd, US red constituency where some guy's just kind of been left to his own devices to run rampant. But given that the US, not only is the US not the only liberal democracy, but like the southern county of Kentucky is not the only liberal democracy, I feel like this is just outweighed, right? So at the end of this clash, I think you are pretty reasonably willing to buy that there is not as much government crackdown, anywhere near as much government crackdown as the negative side points to, right? Even if there is, it's usually ineffective and it often spreads the message more easily and galvanizes people. Before I continue, I'll take a point from the negative side.
Does Fox News call out anti-LGBTQ plus rhetoric?
No, Fox News does not do that, but that's because Fox News is like the most conservatively biased being in existence, right? I feel like that's how the media landscape works, right? Fox News doesn't call out that, and I don't know, whatever like the liberal alternative is, does something else that's crazy, right? And then there are things in between, right? Largely, I don't understand how that has a lot of pertinence here, right? So then secondly, okay, let's talk about independent censorship. This is what we think is really the biggest, constriction of free speech here. And what do we tell you about it? We tell you that the effects are much more tangible. Why? Because a majority of people in their day-to-day life, when they're sharing their opinions and speaking, are not having the government and like the secret police coming over to them and shooting them, right? That is a vast minority of cases. They're not getting arrested. This looks like actors, being fired for speaking their minds, students being denied their degrees, etc. We tell you also that this is the most immediate and proximate harms. What does this look like? This looks like poor old Sam in King's College in Dunedin not being able to be respected, right, by his friends because he's too much of a feminist and he can't stop running his mouth about it, right? They tell you about your job, etc., firing you because they have an incentive to not have, their beliefs, their image disparaged and things. What they tell you about this is a number of things, but largely the one that I think is the most easy to respond to is that your friend group is not an impactful actor because you can move around, right? The idea that, the government's a much more impactful actor because you can move friend groups. The first response to that is you can also move countries, right? Secondly, I feel like most people's friends are fairly important to them, right? People don't just have friends for 5 minutes and then leave them and move on to the next group of friends, because that's not how people work, right? And so, yeah, the second response, I think, here is about digital footprints. This is the thing I flag in my intro, because NEG tells you it's apparently a future harm, that we don't have to worry about it at the moment. But is the fear that is really important here, right? It is not the fact that your digital footprint could kick in. It's the knowledge, right? It's you knowing that that can happen. What does this cause you to do, right? Well, as we tell you from first and then through to second, we tell you that it looks like you are less likely to share your opinions online and things. Note that in our framing, this is where the majority of speech happens, right? While protests are key and important, this is not where the majority of speech takes place. And if we see a huge, significant harm to people sharing their opinions online with these disincentives, right, that is key. We don't see enough of a response from the negative side, and I don't think they have enough time in third neg to make up for that, right? Thirdly, these points around AI that we get presented from the negative side, I think are largely immaterial, because they try to use it in the other point about the states. But I think that AI is not a government, and therefore it actually falls a lot under the sorts of independent censorships, right? So all of the mechanisms that we get around AI actually benefit our side. Before I finish off this point, I'd like to take another POI from the negative side.
Can Sam be a feminist if the government passes a bill saying he can't be a feminist?
No, he can't. But is the New Zealand government highly likely to go through a process where they pass a bill saying you are not allowed to be feminist anymore? No. We prepped in a room that was specifically dedicated to all of the female MPs and prime ministers that have been in this fine establishment for literally 100 years. There are a few of them sitting right in front of me. Would these people allow such a bill to be passed? I certainly don't think so. I think that's arguably quite ridiculous. All right? So at the end of this debate, what do you say? I think the word here is the sharpest blade, right? It is the sharp, in a world of rising inequality, right? Your word, your ability to protest, your ability to speak your mind are some of the biggest ways that you can fight this sort of injustice, right? We correctly identify that ordinary people are much more restricted by all of these other factors, these independent censors, rather than a government that is highly unlikely to persecute them anyway. We, in other words, keep the blade the most sharp on our side. That's why I'm very, very proud to stand. Thank you.
Thank you for the speech. The final member of the panel to introduce is Harper Smith. Harper was on the first team that I ever coached as a coach. I was just the assistant coach, so it was my job to count the POIs. But I must have done a good job because Harper made the New Zealand team and has had an incredible debating career, which she unfortunately did not send me a summary of since then. So you'll just have to trust me when I say she has too many achievements to list. So now, please welcome Third Negating.
What the affirmative side failed to contend with in this debate is the fact that our material has been proved since first to be logically prior to any impacts that they can bring out. They failed to contend with the fact that the United States government brought out the National Guard for the first time since the Vietnam War in order to shut down protests about Israel and Palestine. Two things I'm going to do in this speech. First, I'm going to explain to you why all of these independent actors that they've tried to push down the line are not important in terms of restricting free speech. And second, the more important thing, why the government has disproportionate power that is able to shut down free speech from individuals, especially those from our most vulnerable. First, on the stuff that they told us about independent actors. I won't spend too much time on this because I don't think that's necessary. First, on the people that you're around and the friends that you choose to make. Jamie already told you why it is easy to opt out of friends. It's not like your friend, sometimes it's not about your friends being your ride and die. Sometimes it's about new people that you meet, that you understand because friendships are relatively volatile, social groups are relatively volatile. When you meet new people, it is rather quick to understand their perspectives. That means it's rather easy to opt out. They can't just say that it is impossible, because obviously that's not the case. You're not stuck with your friends for life. Second, on jobs. Two reasons why I don't think this is important. First of all, Jamie already told you why jobs have an incentive to be inclusive in order to pander to larger markets, but also to make sure that they don't get backlash for firing people just due to their political opinion. But second, on the stuff about the state not following you around, I don't think jobs follow you around either. I don't think your employer is stalking you on the street and seeing everything that you say in order to find a reason to fire you. But note that also on university students and how they think that they have nothing to lose compared to people with jobs. Note that they have things to lose, like their literal degree. They have to worry about things like not being able to graduate and have a job in order to feed their future family. They need to worry about things like being blacklisted from academia because they share a different opinion to what their educational institution wants them to have. Note that at the end of this, all of our material is literally logically prior. A lot of the opinions that shut people out from genuine discourse come from the government spreading not state propaganda, but state ideologies influencing the way that people think, that Bruce outlined to you all the way up at first, that they never adequately contended with. But also the stuff that Jamie told you about self-defense that they never also contended with, and I think that it is far too late for anything to happen on that front. Next, on media and how people are going to know a lot about movements on their side. Note that it doesn't matter if people know about movements if nothing actually manifests from them. Sure, loads of people know about the Israel-Palestine conflict, but that never made the government do anything in order to satisfy those voices. loses. It doesn't matter if people know about things if nothing actually happens, because the state constantly shuts down these opinions and makes these opinions unable to be heard and unable to manifest. They can't actualize their free speech. Sure, they can say things, but that doesn't actually matter. What have I proven to you at the end of this point? I've proven to you why independent censorship literally does not matter in the context of the debate, because they literally do not shut down free speech. That means that people are not influenced by their free speech is not as influenced because they can opt out of things. They can choose to, not get followed around by people in their jobs. And the people that generally do like to exercise, people that do exercise their free speech also do have things to lose. Note that at the end of this debate, this is literally all of the Affirmative's positive material. If they can't prove why, these actors have a unique power in order to shut down people's free speech, they can't win this debate. But note that even if you buy this material, two reasons why I don't think you should care about it. First, on depth. A lot of the time, it is not super deep, right? Sometimes it's just about your friends not wanting to talk to you. Compare that to our material, where people are literally getting shot by the government. People are literally getting their voices taken down. People are unable to be themselves with the fear of government violence. But also note that our material is logically prior. We mentioned to you all the way down the line that no matter what they say, it is influenced by the state. It is influenced by what the state tells you to fear. It is influenced by what the state tells you to think. At the end of this, we've already won this debate. I'll take a point now.
Yeah. So why is the ability to say something intrinsically linked to the ability for the government to do what you want them to?
I'll go into that right now. Okay, next on the government. First thing that they told us was that there are checks and balances. 4 responses to this. First of all, the state has the capacity to choose which bills get voted on. Although they may try to mitigate this, note that that means that a lot of things that people care about aren't even going to be passed into government, aren't even going to be put into government to be debated, aren't even going to be in referendums for people to vote on. Note that these are sometimes things that people really, really care about. It's not just about something that your average, your random, person just suddenly wants to talk about. But second of all, for example, Joe Biden has the capacity to literally veto bills that have been, approved. That is a massive reason why they can literally restrict the actualization of free speech, because no matter whether people vote on it or not, there's literally this underlying thing that they can literally say no to it just because they want to. But third, a lot of people don't have the capacity to vote. This looks like a lot of our most disenfranchised groups because they have other things to worry about, like putting food on the table for their kids, not starving on the streets. Those are really important stakeholders that are literally underrepresented in a lot of liberal democracies that mean that the government is not held accountable, especially for our most vulnerable groups. But next, note that what this means is that, I forgot to mention, the stuff that Jamie told you about gerrymandering and judge-mandering is also really important in this debate. I'll explain to you why that is later. But this means that the state literally has the capacity to shut down free speech because it means that people are unable to actually actualize their free speech. They can say things, but the government has a disproportionate capacity to shut that down before it even manifests into anything that protects people. Okay, next on how the government can get voted out. Note that first of all, the average reasonable voter believes that they actually do have free speech rights. That is because compared to the past, they do comparatively have more free speech rights. That doesn't mean that they do have full rights, but also there's a lot of political messaging that tells them that they do have the capacity to say what they want, even when that's not true. But second of all, this has literally never changed, right? Just when the government uses violence to counter protests, there is not enough backlash that actually makes them do anything differently. But third, there's diverse perspectives in things like media that means that it isn't necessarily just hypercritical media of the government. There's a lot of things like right-wing media that is pro shutting down a lot of civil rights protests that mean that there's less of an incentive for the government to actually do something about their behavior. Next, on fear. Note that the state has literally more fear in terms of coercive power. First of all, your average reasonable voter is likely more scared about government power. That is because the government has the capacity to enact legislation that determines how you live. That means that if the state tries to shut down your ability to have free speech, it means you're more likely to comply. But also, protests literally get shut down, and that gets so much media coverage, which means that people are more aware of the government shutting down free speech. Third, I already mentioned that headlines pretty big. Next, on how they try to mitigate gerrymandering. Note that it's literally not it's not about it only happening in one state. It is about the fact that bills that may protect certain groups that have tried to exercise their free speech for so long are now no longer able to be protected because someone who is literally judge-mandering means that they don't want to pass that specific type of bill. It has really large impacts. It's not good enough for them to mitigate it. So, at the end of this point, What have I proven to you? I've proven to you why the state has a massive power in liberal democracies. They cannot deny this. They failed to contend with this down the line. What that means is people are scared to speak. There's been a precedent that has been set by the government. There's a precedent that has been set by everything that is going on in the world that tells people to be scared to speak, or else they will be victimized. They will be shot. They can't do anything because otherwise they are literally going to lose their lives. They are going to lose everything that they've worked for. Note that you should care about this because on scale, this impacts everyone that interacts with the media, everyone that sees these protests being shut down, everyone that is part of these protests that have been violently shut down, and on depth, this is people getting shot by rubber bullets that literally injures them, puts them into the hospital. That's really high impact. So at the end of this, we win on this material. Even if you buy the material, ours is so much more impactful. Stand with the people, stand with negative.
That concludes the substantive portion of the debate, but now we move to the reply section. So these speeches are 4 minutes long and with no POIs. And for reasons that have been lost to time, we reverse the speaking order. So please welcome back the leader of the negating team.
Every day, every conversation, every act we do is a trade-off between people's rights. When we tell people not to be homophobic, we protect people's ability to express themselves. When we fire people who say radical things, we protect the safety of people who are heavily persecuted. The state has the power to break this trade-off. To affect people on a scale that is so large, entire religions can be silenced. Both groups, the state and independent individuals, actively infringe upon free speech. This debate is about who infringes to a greater degree. I think the state clearly has more coercive power on that front. It's very clear we have won this debate. 2 points of clash. First, about which acts of infringement are worse, and second, about how do states and independent people infringe upon rights. On the first point of clash, what do we hear from the affirmative bench? Firstly, is that on their side, when people are able to infringe upon other people's rights to free speech, people lose out on their friend groups and people lose out on their jobs. I think these impacts are probably not the most accurate insofar as it's more likely to be smaller scale things. What we heard from Kathy, it's more like things like, oh, we just don't think you should say that. Things like, we probably don't want to not talking to them for a week. But even if you think these large scale impacts are true, we think the threats, the threats of these impacts are significantly less tangible than the effects of the state. That is, individuals may feel like they're not being heard on a smaller scale on their side, but what we tell you is the state has the ability to influence how people are able to vote, how people are able to protest. This means that the largest displays of free speech, the largest displays of exercisation of what you are actually believing in, those get silenced those get silenced by the state. That is when the people aren't able to vote because of processes like gerrymandering, because of processes where the state are able to influence how people think about certain topics. That's the point at which they're unable to act clearly. I think the degree of harm to which these individuals are affected is significantly greater, the point at which their very fundamental right to talk, their very fundamental right to be able to express themselves on a democratic platform, when that is hindered, I think it's quite clear that the degree to which they are harmed is significantly greater. Moving on to the second point of clash, then, as to how states and independent people infringe upon rights. What we heard from side affirmative is that there exist significant checks and balances that stop states from being able to act in certain ways. What we told you, though, is that states act largely independently from the people who vote them in, even in democracies. Things like the fact that they're able to choose which bills get put into legislature. Things like how they are actively banning things like hijabs, things like talking about gay people in Florida schools. I think it's quite clear that they act independently of the individuals who vote for them. That's the point at which these individuals aren't able to be who they are. I think this level and degree of harm is significantly greater, the point at which the state is able to directly influence what people say. When they're able to send the police in and literally cover people's mouths, as they say on their side of the house, I think that's the point at which people are silenced. When they're able to tackle people in protest, throw gas at them, shoot them with with rubber bullets, I think that's the point at which individuals are significantly more harmed from the state. Even if people are independently able to silence individuals, the degree is significantly lower. Not wanting to talk to someone still lets them just talk to other people who agree with them. But the point at which the state silences you, I think that's really big. How would I judge this debate? Firstly, it's about the scale of harm that is accrued to both sides. I think it's quite clear that when the state silences you, the degree of harm is significantly greater than anything any individual person can do. So even if it happens only one instance every year, I think it's significantly more important, the point at which people aren't able to exercise their rights. I think even if people just have small microaggressions, I think the point is, when people have small microaggressions every day, it probably influences them less. I think the scale of harm is significantly higher on our side of the house. For that reason, I think it's very clear the state is far more oppressive than any individual could ever possibly be. I'm very proud to oppose.
And now to conclude the debate and the final speech of this debate, but not the final speech of the day, please welcome the leader of the Affirmative team.
Every example of a protest that is suppressed in the status quo undermines NZSDC's case. Why? Because they know about them. What you don't know about is all of the things that people in your life would say if they weren't so afraid of what would happen to them in their daily life. 3 things to do in my leaders. Firstly, is the right to free speech equivalent to the right to have the government to do what you want them to? Secondly, on the state. Lastly, on individual censorship. Okay, firstly then, on freedom of speech and what that actually means. Note that if NZSDC is correct, that in order for free speech to ever be actualized, everyone would literally have to be their own state in order to ensure that the policies exactly reflected everything they said. That's pretty stupid. It's obviously never going to happen. What I think is reasonable then, as a conception of free speech, is that the right to say what you want, the ability to say what you want, is what we're talking about, not whether or not that is reflected in policy. Okay. Secondly then, this leads me into the state. Firstly, on the state's incentive. We talk to you a lot about electoral incentives. Note that this is quite different from like referenda, right? It's what is actually happening here is that if the government literally kills somebody for saying something, people are going to vote them out. I think this is probably pretty intuitive, right? But the other thing to note here is that NZSDC literally shoots themselves in the foot when they tell you that people care more about like their ability to eat and their ability to like have a good economy than they do about free speech. What that means is that the incentive for free speech is very low. They literally repeat to you the own mechanism we give you at first. But I think the second thing to note here is that there are other checks and balances that they don't engage with. Things like the judiciary, things like the opposition, that also help to ensure that the government doesn't infringe on free speech. Because if you are killing protesters, that's a pretty easy win for your opposition, right? I think that's also intuitive. But even if the state had incentive, why would that still not matter? Because it's about perception, right? It's not about what actually happens to you when you exercise your free speech. It's about what stops you from doing so in the first place. Both teams implicitly agreed on this metric. I think it's reasonable to use that to judge the debate. They tell you, though, that the average individual believes they have the right to free speech. Correct, right? They believe that the government isn't going to stop them from speaking their mind. That it means that people are going to say what they want to say all of the time. It means they're going to turn up for protests about Israel or Palestine because they don't genuinely believe that they are going to die, right? They don't genuinely believe that the state is actually going to stop them from exercising their voice. I think, like, at their best, where the US state is literally stopping people from saying what they want to say with all of these, like, mechanisms of violence. This is not every other liberal democracy in the world, right? Because they can only give you US examples, I think on aggregate, all of the other liberal democracies are probably doing just fine, right? I go to the protests in Otago literally every week. The government has never come after me. Okay, last thing to note here. Even if you believe every word they say, not 100% of people go to protests, right? People don't go to protests 100% of the time, but 100% of people have social lives and they talk most of the time, right? So, note that at the end of that point, even if the checks and balances here don't always work, at least they exist. That's not true in people's individual relationships. That makes the threat much larger. 4 things to note here. Firstly, on social circles, you can't just move away, right? These are the people who are around you all the time. But also, if you are withholding your own freedom of speech in those casual interactions, that's a pretty massive harm to freedom of speech. Secondly, on jobs, I think if you literally can't get references, if you literally get blacklisted from like being an actuary, for example, that probably means that you just don't exercise that freedom of speech. But thirdly, and most importantly, on proximity, you see this kind of harm all the time. You know people in your life who won't say things because they're afraid of what will happen to them. You probably don't know somebody who got shot by the government for saying something, right? That means that you can't realize that harm is far less likely to impact what you want to say. Look, at the end of this, I can say, for example, that I think a particular sponsorship is a bad idea. The government's not going to come after me, but maybe my coaches will.
I hope you all enjoyed watching the debate as much as I did and gave you a lot to think about. What will happen now is that our judges will retire to deliberate, make their decision, come, form their vote, fill in all the certificates as well, please, judges, and then they'll return later to tell us who has won. While they do that, we'll be hearing from a very, very different kind of judge, though. I'm very pleased to be able to say that our patron this year is Sir Stephen Koch, the Justice of the Supreme Court. We're very, very, very lucky to have such a distinguished patron who is not only such an esteemed person who adds so much to our organization, but is also an incredibly active patron, having hosted at the Supreme Court and having watched the students' debate on Sunday. So please welcome up Sir Stephen Koch.
Well, tēnā koutou katoa, Minister Chris Bishop, the Honourable Deborah Russell, the Honourable Jan Tinetti, Dr Mulgan. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been lovely to be here this weekend, to have watched the debaters yesterday, to have hosted you at the Supreme Court on Friday, and to have heard the excellent debate we've just heard. We've heard arguments all through the weekend and today which wouldn't be out of place in my courtroom, although they have been delivered at a rather faster pace than we would allow. At the opening of this competition at the Supreme Court on Friday evening, I remarked on how appropriate it was that we were starting the Nationals at the Supreme Court and that we're going to end them at Parliament today, because all three institutions are built on a foundation and a tradition of debate. Speaking at a previous final, I once called courts and Parliament the temples of the voice because of how powerful oral argument is in each of those places. But I want to make a slightly different point to you today. It is an institutional point. The courts and Parliament and the universities were where you were yesterday and on Saturday, are the cathedrals of debate, because they are the places where we really celebrate and worship debate. And that, in turn, is because they depend on the high quality of debate that occurs within their precincts. In a hugger-mugger world with social and electronic media in a cacophony of communication, debate stands out as something especially powerful and especially important. That's because debate has two particular features that other forms of communication do not have. First, balance, because debate has to have at least two sides opposing each other. And secondly, rules, which keep debate honest, rigorous, civilised and courteous. In a world in which the media has become populated with alternative truths, and just about any crackpot idea seems to be able to get airtime, balance and rules producing rigour and honesty and courtesy are tremendously important. Debate should be worshipped. Free speech is all very well, but debate is better. Now, I want to make just 2 points for you today to take away. One relates to the mechanism of debating, and the other to the place of universities, or probably more particularly to the place that you will occupy at universities in the years ahead of you. I was a New Zealand universities debater in the early 1980s and went on a debating tour to the United States. We had 35 debates in 35 days across 10 different motions. The American debating style was a curious one. High speed, not a pause for breath it seemed, Fact after fact after fact, all drawn from small, portable filing cabinets that travelled from campus to campus with the debaters. The New Zealand debating style was different. We sought to persuade, sometimes to entertain at the same time. But make no mistake, we were out to win with our technique. It would be boastful for me to say that we won all of our debates, so I won't say that. Instead, much more modestly, I'll simply say we didn't lose any of them. Now, the point I'm making is that debate, whether it's in a school, a university, a courtroom, or a parliament, is about persuasion. It is about grabbing the audience's mind and keeping it. It's about identifying 2 or 3 good arguments why you should win and why they should lose. You're never going to win because you have 15 good arguments and the other side could only muster 13. There are never 15 good arguments in any debate or any case. Motions just aren't that fertile. So it's about seizing and seeing the fatal weakness in your opponent's argument and reminding the audience of just how ridiculous or desperate their case must be because they rely upon it. And sometimes good debating involves silence. Don't be afraid of pausing, because you do that for emphasis. In cross-examination, a pregnant silence often precedes a witness's destruction, and often follows it too, so that we can all draw breath and admire the wreckage. So I suppose what I'm saying is this: good debating isn't about overwhelming the opponents with a tsunami of facts, because all that produces is a tsunami of facts in response. Good debating is about picking your arguments, using intelligence and voice and timing, and convincing an audience that you must be right. My last point is about the places that you will soon take up in tertiary education. Most of you, I imagine, will be going to universities, but the same applies to any tertiary institute. Universities and tertiary institutes are built on the spirit of debate too. But the most important debates that take place at university are the ones that happen in the lecture theatre. It's the exchange of ideas between teacher and student, the teacher questioning the student, and the student questioning the teacher. So what I want to say to you is this: when you go to university, resist the temptation to engage in passive learning. Resist just reading textbooks or listening to your lectures online, on your laptop, in your bedroom. Go to the lecture theatre. Enliven the debate that occurs every day in every teaching room at every university with your voice and with your questions. That is how you will learn best, and in doing so you make the lecture a better lecture and the university you attend a better institution. Just one good question in one lecture on one day has that effect. So that's what I want to say to you. This has been a wonderful competition. It's a real privilege to be your patron. My congratulations to the organisers, my thanks to the sponsors, and my particular thanks and congratulations to all of you who've participated with such distinction and ability and energy and courage across this weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Stephen. It's always a pleasure to hear from such an eloquent and articulate speaker, and to have you to be able to say that you are our patron. Our next speech will come. Our next 2 speeches will be from students at the tournament, who will talk to you about their experiences, the friends they've made, and the good times that they've had. And the first student to give one of those speeches from the Central North Island team will be Nathan Yu. So please welcome Nathan.
Returning this year for Nationals was truly a completely different experience than last year. I was no longer a reserve who could just have fun between the rounds with the other reserves and go on my phone in the back of the room playing Candy Crush pretending I was listening to the other debates. I never understood exactly what it was like to debate at Nationals, so this year it was really different to have some first experiences in terms of just the sheer amount of work that actually has to go into going through 7 rounds of debating, as well as scribbling down an exhausting amount of info slides. Also, special shout out to the conveners and AGCOR for a very well and organised and on-time Nationals. I was genuinely so impressed at how smoothly things ran and that there was no delays, as there normally is. Over these past few days, I've been devastated hearing that the reserves watched Mean Girls while I was prepping, and I'm actually the reason they watched it, influencing my reserves because they were uncultured and didn't watch Mean Girls before this day. I have learned so much about debating at Nationals this year, but I've learned 3 key things. Firstly, info slides are actually useful. They're not annoying. Do write them down. If you say, "Thank you, adjudicator," in unison in 3 with all of your teammates, you either freak them out or you win over the entire panel, which gives you the debate. Also, my last lesson that I learned is do not hold your noise-making dinosaur mascot whilst in a debate because he will 100% absolutely go off at the end and get given the stink eyes. There are so many thank yous I want to give off for being able to be here today. Firstly, my incredible team this year. Oliver and Alice, you guys were amazing reserves to have this year. Whether it was running to grab us lunch so we didn't miss out or being able to fill in for all of our practice debates throughout this year, you're extremely reliable. Tyler, we eventually got there in the end to keep your setup to a minimum, but then when the coaches decided for us to mech dump, we lost our timing. Nevertheless, we got there in the end, and I think you just have incredible potential for the next couple of years as you're only year 11. Esther, being the only one who was experienced at speaking with Nats, returning from last year, going into this, you were an extremely wonderful help in times of struggling to find a case, as bringing some much-needed girl power to the team and ensuring we always would slay in for feminist and IR motions. Don't worry, I think I can carry the torch of feminist queen on CNI next year. To the 2 members from last year, Tane, I know you were put into the deep end with first after being comfortable with third and thinking that prep is for losers, but I think you really did an amazing job and you were a great help for Eco Motions as well. And now look at you, coaching one of the best teams here at this year. Liv, I don't know where to start. Being a senior at my school, it was always fun yet scary having you on the same team as me because I would always see you around school after saying something embarrassing at training. I feel I've picked up so many things from you, including my hatred of eco-motions, love for pop culture, as well as a scarily similar style. Whether any of that is for the better or the worse, I think that's rather subjective. Anyway, thank you, Liv. To all of the wonderful coaches I've had in the past years, Sophie and Kara, thanks for providing supportive advice to my speeches, as well as being able to provide wonderful snacks. Sophie, special shout out for being able to bake vegan cookies because I can't eat eggs or dairy. Those were wonderful. Finally, as a head coach over both years, what fun times filled with even more fun quotes, and in the end, I know all of the face palms, laughs, and googles in this weekend during my speeches were just because you loved them so much, not because I didn't know what I was saying. I had such a great time this year at Nats this weekend, being able to debate, but mostly just being able to meet most of the people in this room and form friendships that I hope last for multiple years. I think everyone did an extremely good job this weekend, being able to make it through 7 tough rounds, and I think everyone should be extremely proud of themselves. I do hope to relive this experience next year and return for my 3rd year, a part of CNI.
Thank you for that lovely speech, Nathan. Our next student speaker is from the Kahurangi Marlborough regional team, and that is Finn Kirby Pingat, so please welcome him up.
Does anyone else wonder what's in there? I was just looking at it before. Hopefully something cool. All right. First thing to flag before I begin my speech today. Don't joke at Nats too much because it doesn't help you win debates and ultimately they just make you give the speech at the end. Kia ora koutou. So debate kids are really annoying, right? I can say that because the Free Speech Union is here to protect me. You take objectively the most argumentative bunch of people in the most stubborn and annoying years of their lives, rank them on their ability to spin rubbish yarns and say, we need to lock these kids in Rutherford House immediately. What were they thinking was going to happen when they did that? Because in theory, we would all avoid the social interaction like the plague. In theory, just being here would give everyone the biggest superiority complex to take back home, but somehow, in reality, life finds a way. In reality, you're actually all right people. And finally, in reality, all of these years of spending the month of May locked in, or sometimes out of, cold university classrooms, babbling on about entirely fake things like economics, have been some of the most impactful experiences of my life. So who have I got to thank for this process, which began as a bright-eyed young lad from the metropolis of Nelson? I'll start on my teammates. Kahirangi Marlborough Regional Debating is not for the faint of heart. You see, all the other regions, right? After Nats, they don't have anything else, no more events. They pretty much just go from Nats to next year's Nats. In KM, we are the only region to have other tournaments like Prem A, Prem B, Prem C, and it goes all the way through the rest of the alphabet. In fact, Wellington. This is really annoying because it gives us way too much opportunity to develop and practice and get better at debating. Secondly, there is the large culture shock going from the bustling city of Nelson into the ghost town of Wellington. Chris Bishop, I've got some ideas about fixing that, which you might like. I know this would never happen, but hypothetically, it would be great for council to write a district plan with like better housing intensification or something. It would be great if you approved it, specifically the Miramar gas tank. That would be great. Secondly, you could suss out some kind of transport program to, I don't know, get Wellington moving. Anyways. The third reason why Kahirangi Marlborough debating is specifically hard is because the flights just take way too long. We are way too far away and the travel is ridiculous. Fortunately, we have a private jet reserved for us through our sponsors at Origin Air. Thank you. All right. Despite all of that, my first and third speakers, Riley and Stella, have been really stellar. Thank you for teaching me that a national reserve is money rather than a secret stockpile of dairy and wool exports hidden under Bowen House. I promise that this isn't evidence that the left is worse on the economy. Thank you for making our 2 years so great, the both of you, and I'm so excited to see what you get up to next. Next group that I have to thank is the coaches. Coaches, I see you. Last night, I told you that after this year, I finally understood what debating was all about, and that if I could only listen to your feedback again, it would just click, and I would get straight 80s. While the 80s part is intuitively and empirically true, so I won't bother to mechanize it now, unfortunately, I lied about the rest of it, because the moment that I truly understood debating was even later last night, when I got on the elevator and Bob told me you just have to W-riz the edge. Okay. So to be thematically consistent with the Bay of Plenty, and I fear that they mog me egregiously with their skibbity speeches, they did pretty well, so clearly they know what they're talking about. Perhaps, though, it's best that I didn't take all of my feedback from Bob, and I actually got some from my own coaches. Because at the end of the day, they're responsible not only for somehow improving our debating, but also for the hours of logistical work which go behind the entire process, and also for ensuring that the Nats weekend is fun. So naturally, I ran some cost-benefit analysis, after which I conclude that every coach in this room is either incredibly foolish or outrageously altruistic. I know it's the latter in my case, so for that, I have to say thanks. It's often said that you shouldn't try and quantify the people that you're thanking, because you will inevitably miss someone, which is why I'm going to try my best to do it anyways. Thank you to Lucy for teaching New Zealand's most beautiful region how to make equally beautiful points. Thank you to Ethan for giving me the official National Bros Guide to the Terrace and the Parliamentary Precinct, and for respectfully putting into practice what people mean when they told me about the different perspectives that debating was going to bring, especially in an election year. Thank you to Emily for keeping us alive on the road crossings of Lambton Quay, and for stopping Riley from developing a debilitating vape addiction on Cuba Street. Thank you to Liv for being a true rural queen and for helping me access my divine feminine energy in prep for the feminism motion that never actually came. Thank you to Tony for taking time out of your summer to run Dev, although you live in Dunedin, so there was no such thing as summer in the first place. Minus points for you. Finally, thank you to North for being, firstly, a KM graduate, right? For being the good cop in the coaching dynamic and for making training as chaotic as they were funny. Final point of substantive now on the mates that we've all made, because maybe the real breaking was the friends all along the way. Along my journey from being a year 11 with no break night party invites to being a year 12 who initially thought that 12:06 was a time rather than the room number where it all went down, I've been privileged to meet so many talented people through debating. To those I've debated with and against, it has been uniquely impactful on me to spend so much time with like-minded or not so like-minded people selected from across the country for broadly the same reasons, which is just yapping. That has been huge to me, and that is all thanks to you. It's also clear that half of you lot are probably going to be justices, ministers, MPs, so just hit me up when you get into the big one over there. Finally, I'll be one of many today to thank the adjudicators and conveners, but it can't be understated the efforts that have gone into this and how remarkable it is to have a debating tournament which isn't trained, which has actually run to time. Miracle. Okay, and finally, thank you to the true Kiwi patriots, those who backed the locals, those who backed the underdogs, those who backed KM. Thank you to Origin Air.
Lots of debaters go on to study law. Some of them go on to study medicine. But our next speaker did both of those and now works as both a practicing lawyer and medical doctor. As far as I know, the only person to do that in New Zealand. Chris Bishop tells me he was also involved, though, in the establishment of this organization back in the 80s when we were first being set up by Chris Bishop's mother and our next speaker, Dr. Rodger, amongst many other people. As well as his involvement in the debating community, though, he's also the chairman of the Free Speech Union. The Free Speech Union have sponsored this grand final because they support our mission of encouraging critical thinking and open discussion amongst the next generation of school children. We are a charity and we are reliant on funding from our generous sponsors, such as the Free Speech Union and our many, many regional sponsors, including Origin Air and all the other sponsors who've sponsored regional teams, so that we can ensure debating is accessible to everyone, regardless of their financial background. We're sending the World's team to Serbia this year, and if you've ever looked at a map, it's very, very far away, very expensive to do that, and so we're very, very thankful for the support of all of our sponsors. So please welcome Dr. Rodger Mulligan.
Oh, thank you, everybody. You heard from Sir Stephen an injunction to respect the civilised exchange of ideas. The Free Speech Union is a little bit more of your pit bull in this space. There's a quote attributed to George Orwell that said, "Sport is war without guns." And what he was referencing is that ever since human beings got together in groups, we've had this urge to bash each other. And if we're going to have a society that works, we have to find some way of managing that. And that's what cricket and rugby are. They're our urge to dominate each other and nobody dies. Now, it's not just our physical aggression that needs management. We also feel strongly about issues, ideas, perspectives, religion, principles of life. And they're not all compatible with each other. And we need some way that that gets managed, because otherwise we all die. What's happened here today is not just an entertaining clash of wits. What's here today is practice for what we need to make the world work properly. Now, there is a view out there that we in the Free Speech Union feel quite strongly about. And that's where people say, free speech is important, but. Free speech is important, but not about co-governance. There's only one right view about that. Free speech is important, but not climate change. There's only one right view about that. Now, I suggest to you that free speech means nothing unless it means the right to contradict the mainstream, the right to be eccentric, the right to speak truth to power, and the right to be wrong. Now, if you doubt that, I suggest to you that we live in a world very, very different in its perspectives from the past. 100 years ago, it was by no means obvious that women could be trusted with the vote. 200 years ago, it was by no means obvious that non-white people had the same abilities as white people. I could go on. I could mention homosexuality. Now, we live in a world that's very different because those perspectives could be challenged, because opinions that were fringe could be heard. It was once fringe to challenge these beliefs. You live in a world that is much more progressive, much more inclusive, much more understanding, because those debates could happen. And we say it doesn't stop. There will always be a need to evaluate what society believes, to evaluate what the mainstream believes, and to allow the best ideas to win or lose in the marketplace of ideas. That's how it works. So shortly, the judges will come out, and they will tell you that one team has won. But I suggest to you that we've all won, and we're all better off for as long as this sort of activity is supported. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodger. I believe the judging panel has returned, so we'll now move on to our prize giving. I'd like to invite up our Chief Adjudicator, Harper Smith, to announce the winners, and also I'm going to invite up, once again, the Honourable Chris Bishop to present the first set of awards to the winners.
All right, I won't actually be presenting the winners right this second. That will be Daniel, the chair of our panel. But what I will be presenting is some recognition for what was excellent performances over the course of the entire weekend, not just today. And the first set of awards that I'll be presenting are for promising speakers. These are speakers who are not yet in their last year of school, but who have shown immense promise across the tournament, and we're very excited to see what they will get up to in the future. Hopefully back at this tournament or in other types of debating activities. So the first Promising Speaker Award I'd like to present will go to Shay McGivern. The second Promising Speaker Award goes to Manuia Fox-Romia. And the final Promising Speaker Award is actually our Most Promising Speaker Award, which will be presented with, I believe, the Rosemary Dixon Cup. And that award this year goes to Ollie Farquharson from Bond. The next set of awards are for highly commended speakers, and the first highly commended award goes to Rena Wen. The second highly, The second highly commended award goes to Jas Karen Korahi. The final highly commended award goes to Sebastian Hein Sheldrake. The next two awards I'm going to present are for the Reserve to the New Zealand Schools Debating Team 2024. Liam's already told you that we're sending a team to Serbia. These two individuals, in the event that someone from the team cannot make it, will step up and fill in for the team. The first award for Reserve to the New Zealand Schools team is Teresa Ing. The second Reserve to the New Zealand Schools team is Isabella McKeffrey. Now on to the announcement of the New Zealand Schools Debating Team for 2024. The first member of the New Zealand Schools Debating Team is Luka Riri Nui. The second member of the New Zealand Schools Debating Team is Bruce Zhang. The third member of the New Zealand Schools Debating Team is Jamie Pett. The next member of the New Zealand Schools Debating Team is Clara Ballantyne. And the final member of the New Zealand Schools Debating Team for 2024 is Alan Chen. I also have two extra special awards to present. The first is for the captain of the New Zealand Schools Debating Team. This person is someone who, aside from exemplary debating skills, the adjudication core and all the judges at the tournament have felt demonstrated extraordinary leadership capacity, and we think will be an excellent, excellent captain for this year's schools team, and that person is Clara Ballantyne. And finally, we have the award for Best Speaker at the New Zealand Schools Debating Tournament this year. This is across all of the rounds, and I'm very proud to announce that that person is Luka Riri Nui. Excellent. I'll now hand over to Daniel, the chair of our panel, to announce the result of the debate.
Thank you, everyone. We thoroughly enjoyed that debate. I'd like to welcome Sir Stefan up to help present the awards to the winning teams and to the runners-up. In a unanimous decision, the winner is the affirming Otago. And I'd also like to welcome up and give a huge round of applause to the runners-up from Auckland Blue.
Thanks, everyone. That brings us to the end of our 36th National Championships at New Zealand schools debating. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the distinguished guests who've shown up to spectate the final. Deborah Russell, Jan Tinetti, Karen Chow from the Action Party was here earlier as well, and of course, Christopher Bishop and Sir Stephen Koch, our patron. It is a real credit to our organization to be able to count so many distinguished people amongst our alumni. I think Simeon Brown's also down the back now, so if you're from an electorate that is represented by one of those MPs, I encourage you to go up and chat to them, maybe get a few photos with them, and you know, stay engaged with them. So now the tournament is over, but there is an opportunity for a few more photos in the Grand Hall. If you'd like to do so, please, you know, go and talk to all the friends that you've made over this weekend, add them on Facebook, do all that kind of stuff so that you can stay in touch after these nationals, and you know, keep coming back next year and keep those connections that you've made going over the course of the rest of the school year. Before I send you all out, a few small admin notes. If you were announced as a member of the New Zealand team, please track down the coaches and so that you can chat to them about practice arrangements, get your contact details, all that kind of thing. If you're on the Central North Island team, your bus is leaving quite early, so go rush over to wherever you have to catch it from after that. Otherwise, please grab your luggage from the travel lodge, have a safe journey home, and I hope you enjoyed the weekend.